So with all that out of the way, I think we should get into it. And I think it's fitting that we start off with the Lusaka Manifesto on Southern Africa, which was signed by 13 East and Central African nations at its creation between the 14th and 16th of April, 1969. It was a document created to oppose minority colonial rule across the African countries, and by extension to endorse and support the liberation struggles many Southern African countries were going through in any way that they could. Kaunda played a very pivotal role as one of the key advocates of the manifesto and host of the convention that took place in Lusaka that led to the creation of the document. So I'm going to read a small excerpt from the document to give you a rough idea of the sentiment that was held by the signatory governments that initially backed the document. This is paragraph 2 of the final document that was published by the government of Tanzania. By this manifesto, we wish to make clear beyond all shadow of doubt our acceptance of the belief that all men are equal and have equal rights to human dignity and respect, regardless of color, race, religion, or sex. We believe that all men have the right and the duty to participate as equal members of society in their own government. We do not accept that any individual or group has any right to govern any other group of sane adults without their consent, and we affirm that only the people of a society acting together as equals can determine what is for them a good society and a good social, economic, or political organization. End quote. So the Lusaka Manifesto, after its publishing and after its creation in 1969, would later, in the same year of 1969, on September 9th of that year, actually be adopted by the Organization of African Unity, and it would subsequently be endorsed to the UN General Assembly. And the UN would later also adopt and endorse the Lusaka Manifesto on the 20th of September that same year at the 24th General Assembly. There was a roll call vote that resulted in 113 states being in favor of the Lusaka Manifesto on Southern Africa and 2 states being against it. And then 2 states absented voting on the resolution. So the 2 states that were against it were Portugal and South Africa, obviously. And the 2 states that absented were Cuba and Malawi. I believe that the reason Cuba absented in voting on this resolution was because Cuba held the very true opinion that when it came to the liberation of the African people, it would only be truly achieved through armed struggle. And the adoption and the endorsement of the Lusaka Manifesto would hinder and would jeopardize the armed struggles that various Southern African and just generally African countries were engaging in. I don't think I need to explain to you guys why South Africa and Portugal opposed the resolution to adopt the Lusaka Manifesto. But for those of you who may not know, South Africa at the time was going through apartheid, and Portugal had 2 colonies in Southern Africa that they were trying very, very hard to hold on to, and this would obviously throw a spanner in the works for them. They were also going through an armed struggle with the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, Frelimo in Mozambique, and I believe they were also going through an armed struggle with the MPLA and UNITA in Angola. So Kaunda's position as key negotiator was so significant that when U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger visited South Africa on behalf of the U.S. to extend efforts in trying to reach some sort of an amicable resolution on the Southern African security situation, he went to Kaunda with his report from the meeting he had with B.J. Vorster and Ian Smith in Pretoria. In the conversation that was happening between the apartheid government and also the Rhodesian government and the armed groups that were essentially fighting for their liberation in apartheid South Africa and in Rhodesia, the conversation would mostly happen and be mediated by Kaunda, because all of these movements, like I mentioned before at the beginning of this episode, were in some way, shape, or form associated to Zambia. A lot of them had presence in Zambia. A lot of them had their headquarters in Zambia. And so whenever any sort of diplomatic conversation would need to happen between one colonial government and the armed groups that were engaged in a liberation struggle against these governments, it would in some way, shape, or form typically involve Kenneth Kaunda. And that's why when Henry Kissinger came down to Southern Africa, he had to go and report to Kaunda about what was discussed because there was nobody else to report to. If you wanted to have access to all of these armed groups in pretty much any country that was going through an armed struggle in Southern Africa, the point of contact was Kenneth Kaunda. So yes, the following is, I'm going to read an excerpt from a telegram that Henry Kissinger sent to the United States, to the U.S. President's Assistant for National Security Affairs. He sent this telegram on September 21st, 1976, after having a meeting with Kaunda. From Pretoria, I flew to Lusaka, Zambia on Monday to report to President Kaunda what I had obtained from Forster and Smith. I went over with Kaunda in a 3-hour private meeting the Rhodesia program that Smith had accepted. The 5 points I reported to you yesterday for majority rule in 2 years and an immediate provisional government. I told him this is what they had been seeking for 11 years and now was the time to move. So at this point, when Kissinger was getting involved in this conversation, the Second Chimurenga, which was the war that led to the liberation of Zimbabwe, had been raging on since around 1964. And it was getting to a point where something desperately needed to be done about it. And that's where you see Henry Kissinger jumping in and getting involved in this conversation. So the Lusaka Manifesto would go on to aid the independence of many of the countries that made up the frontline states. The frontline states was a multilateral coalition of mostly Southern African states that did a lot to isolate apartheid South Africa through many efforts, through economic activity, through provision of military aid and refuge, predominantly for the ANC and the Southwest African People's Organization, which was the liberation movement that was engaging in the fight for liberation in Namibia. And they also isolated South Africa through a lot of, on the diplomatic front, through a lot of diplomatic pressure at the level of the UN. A lot of these states were members of the OAU, so they could sort of band together and isolate South Africa on the diplomatic front by constantly lobbying the UN to accept resolutions like the Lusaka Manifesto and many other declarations that were made by the UN. And a lot of these efforts would be spearheaded by Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia and Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, who was the prime minister, or I believe president of Tanzania. Yeah, so that was the Lusaka Manifesto in Southern Africa. And if you'd like to check it out, there's going to be a link in the description where you can check out all of the resources that I used to bring all of this information to you guys.